Well, this is the video that I didn't want to make today because as it turns out, that Rex Airlines, one of the big airlines in Australia, has encountered some financial difficulties and is proceeding to no longer trade. What this means is that they have some administrators popping in to help run the airline and see how they can get out of their financial difficulty of around $80 million loss over the last 2 years, and to see where they can go forward into the future. And you can see here that just now they've started to actually stop selling tickets as well. So that's a little bit frustrating for people who are flying, on Hobart to Melbourne, or if you're flying over to Perth, all these sort of other routes. They'll probably keep flying Sydney to Melbourne because that makes sense. Now, if you didn't actually know, Rex Airlines is one of sort of Australia's I'm in the way here. One of Australia's sort of bigger airlines. You can see that they do a whole bunch of different routes. They mainly focus on regional travel, but they also have these big, thick red lines that you can see on screen that link all the cities. Now, this wasn't always the case. Back in the day, they only had those two networks, the orange ones and the green ones, which they operated with a fleet of Saab sort of smaller planes, which you can see here. If I bring this up on screen, you can see this sort of regional express aircraft that they have here that they fly around. But during COVID times, Virgin Australia encountered some financial problems and sort of stopped flying. So Rex saw that as an opportunity to jump in. And what they decided to do was actually use the COVID money that they have to get themselves some of these 737s. Now, these were actually from Virgin Australia. So these aeroplanes were actually coming in here and they're complete inside the configuration. They say Virgin Australia. It's the same seats and the same layout, but then they just repainted the outside. And they got around about 10 to start that sort of domestic Australian service. And if you didn't know that Australia has one of the best domestic markets when it comes to passenger numbers, because not many people, there's no fast train linking the cities. You're not going to fly Sydney to Melbourne. It's about 8 hours sort of driving if you just don't stop. So a half an hour to an hour flight is perfect for these things. And so this is what Rex wanted to do, is that they wanted to fly these and jump into the market, but they were hedging their bet that Virgin Australia would not be coming back. And unfortunately, that is not the case. Virgin Australia got a bailout and then have since come back into the fore and now become a bigger airline. And this has resulted in the market conditions for Rex no longer being that profitable. And so basically now we're seeing them potentially going to fold here in Australia, which would be a big deal for those regional markets that I just talked about. So we're seeing a whole bunch of reaction right now. This is all happening today. We're seeing the Australian government saying that we don't want them to fold because then the poor regional Australians who live way out in the middle of nowhere, if we go back to that regional map, you can see all the green route and sort of the orange route, they're going to have to rely on Qantas. And those tickets are already like thousands of Australian dollars. So like 500 to 700 US dollars to fly something like, half an hour, 45 minutes on one of these little planes, which carry about 34 passengers. So you can see that. And so basically what they're trying to do now is figure out a way that this makes sense for the airline to continue, because obviously their big gamble to replace Virgin Australia as the second biggest airline behind Qantas has not necessarily come to fruition. And it is a difficult thing because the Australian market, a lot of people think like, if the airfares are so high and other things are so easy, then what is going on here? Like, why is this not working? But there are several different factors why this didn't exactly work out. The first one is that the Australian wages are so high for staff and pilots and such. The second one is that the rise in fuel prices and making that more expensive. But those are inconsequential compared to the problem with landing slots, because you see that here in Australia, the airlines actually need to compete for landing slots and you can actually hold them. So basically what happens in Australia is that there is a government body that monitors aircraft landing slots, and their rules are really archaic. They said that as long as an airline flies the landing slots in occasion, they don't actually need to have full flights. So Qantas will run a plane on one of these landing slots and then cancel it when nobody books tickets for it, and they get to maintain that slot. That means there are sort of tens to hundreds of landing slots per week that are actually going completely unused, and airlines like Rex can't jump in there, meaning that Rex needs to pay a fortune or have to sacrifice its other landing slots to fly into Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane Airport. Now you're probably thinking this is government controlled, so therefore it would be rather good, but it's actually not. It's horribly inefficient, and it's something that needs to be completely overturned, and that's probably something that's going to happen with this upcoming white paper that's coming out here in Australia. This will benefit new entrant airlines wanting to set up services, crack down on slot misuse, and create a more level playing field in slot allocation, which is one of the major problems here in Australia. But this seems like it might be all too late, with Rex having these sort of issues coming to the forefront now. Basically, without this other Australian airline, it's just going to come down to Qantas and a small airline, Virgin Australia, in the market, and it's not going to be a win for customers. And of course, this news is rather familiar with the demise of Bonza, which actually happened earlier on this year. That airline was flying regional routes with Boeing 737 MAX aircraft around Australia, but unfortunately they were also unable to be successful. And when they did collapse, a lot of people asked the government to step in, who they initially refused. So seeing that the government wants to potentially step in and is considering all options to save Rex Airlines is a little bit funny when they didn't do this earlier on in the year. But I do agree that something has to be done to make the Australian aviation market more competitive and stop the monopoly of Qantas getting any stronger. Now, I love Qantas and I love to fly on Qantas internationally, but it does hurt as a customer and seeing the consumer market. And of course, it sucks as an Australian to see this happen, because we can't just rely on Qantas and Virgin Australia to provide international routes. In fact, Qantas is a huge carrier in Australia that's flying domestically and most, I would say 99% of all the international routes, with Virgin Australia only providing a few smaller routes like to Bali with their 737 MAX aircraft. So to see Rex take a leap at becoming a bigger, stronger airline and to fail to reach it is a problem, but it's not their fault. It's because of the current market forces and because of the way that the Australian domestic market is set up. And until those are resolved, this is going to be a continuous story, like we saw with Bonza and like we're now seeing with Rex, and we're seeing with all the other failures that have happened over in Australian history, like ANZ, that happened way back when. So what do you think? What do you think of this news? Let me know down in the description, and hopefully we're praying for Rex.